They sat silently together for the first and last time. Two red and white McLarens nestled in the gravel trap of Suzuka's first corner, their carbon fiber bodies interlocked in a deadly embrace. One driver, Ayrton Senna, sat motionless in his cockpit, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and determination, willing the marshals to pry his car free so he could continue his charge. The other, Alain Prost, had already accepted his fate, climbing out of his machine with a resigned shrug, the gesture of a man who had seen this coming from the moment the lights went out. It was 1989, and what had begun as a sporting competition between teammates had just escalated into all-out war. This was no mere racing incident. It was the violent, inevitable culmination of two opposing forces that could no longer occupy the same space in the Formula One universe. The Senna-Prost rivalry represents the most intense, complex, and defining conflict in motorsport history. It was a clash that transcended sport, pitting not just two drivers, but two fundamentally different worldviews against each other. On one side stood Alain the Professor Prost, the cerebral Frenchman who calculated races like chess matches, believing victory should be achieved at the slowest possible speed. On the other stood Ayrton Senna, the spiritual Brazilian who drove with a divine fury, pushing himself and his car to the absolute limit, convinced that winning required total commitment, even if it meant straddling the line between brilliance and catastrophe. For 6 tumultuous years, their battle would redefine what it meant to be a champion, expose the dark underbelly of Formula One politics, and ultimately transform two teammates into the bitterest of enemies, whose reconciliation would only come through tragedy. To understand the explosive nature of their conflict, one must first appreciate the towering individual legends that preceded it. Alain Prost arrived at McLaren in 1980 as a driver already approaching his prime. His nickname, the Professor, was earned through a racing philosophy that was both intellectual and ruthlessly efficient. He was a master of conservation, of tires, fuel, and his own energy, calculating that consistent point scoring, rather than flamboyant wins, was the surest path to championships. His driving style appeared almost languid, dismissing corners with subtle technique that made him appear to be on a Sunday cruise, until the stopwatch revealed the devastating truth. By the time Senna joined him at McLaren in 1988, Prost had already secured 2 world championships, 1985-1986, and was widely regarded as the best driver in the world, a master strategist both in the car and in the political corridors of F1 power. Ayrton Senna da Silva emerged from Brazil with a talent so profound it seemed otherworldly. Where Prost was calculation, Senna was passion personified. His approach was one of all-out attack, a relentless assault on the circuit that often bordered on the transcendent. He was a qualifier without peer, capable of digging deep into what he described as a different dimension to pull out laps that defied belief, particularly around the streets of Monte Carlo, where he was virtually untouchable. Senna's motivation was not merely victory, but total domination. He arrived at McLaren in 1988 after a spectacular 1984 season where in an inferior Toleman he had nearly stolen victory from Prost in the rain-soaked Monaco Grand Prix, catching the Frenchman at an astonishing 3 to 4 seconds per lap before the race was controversially stopped. That day, the first spark of rivalry was lit. Prost had won the battle, but he had seen the future, and it was closing fast in his mirrors. The 1988 McLaren MP4.4, powered by a dominant Honda engine, was the stage for their initial duel. It was one of the most dominant cars in F1 history, winning 15 of 16 races. For the first time, Prost found himself with a teammate who could not only match, but often surpass his speed, particularly in qualifying. The psychological warfare began almost immediately. In a famous joint interview, After the 1988 German Grand Prix, an awkward, crackling tension was palpable. Senna, his arm draped possessively behind Prost, fixed his rival with a pointed look. When asked if equality between them was possible, Senna shook his head. "No," he stated unequivocally. "There can only be one winner." The message was clear. This would be a fight to the finish. The statistics revealed their contrasting strengths. Senna was the qualifying maestro, with a staggering 26 poles to Prost's 4, demonstrating his single-lap supremacy. However, Prost's racecraft and consistency often paid greater dividends. He finished higher on average and, crucially, outscored Senna over both seasons in total points. This points tally hit a crucial controversy. Senna won the 1988 title under a rule that counted only the best 11 results, without which Prost would have been champion. The Frenchman felt cheated by a system he believed favored flamboyance over consistency, sowing the seeds of resentment that would soon erupt. The 1989 San Marino Grand Prix at Imola was the point of no return, where professional rivalry curdled into personal animosity. Before the race, the two McLaren drivers had made a gentleman's agreement. Whoever led into the first corner after the start would be allowed to keep the lead, unchallenged, until after the Tosa corner. Senna, starting from pole, initially led, but when the race was restarted after a serious crash for Gerhard Berger, Prost made the better getaway. As they approached Tosa, Senna ignored their pact, diving down the inside to retake the lead. Prost was livid, feeling betrayed not just by a broken promise, but by a fundamental breach of racing ethics. He reportedly threatened to quit the sport, leading to an emergency team summit that only served to air their grievances publicly, igniting a civil war within McLaren. The trust was gone, replaced by a Cold War that would soon turn hot. The conflict reached its violent climax at the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix in Suzuka, with the championship on the line. Prost, leading the title race, knew that Senna needed to win to keep his hopes alive. As Senna closed in during the late stages, the Frenchman knew what was coming. Approaching the final chicane, Senna dived for a gap that was rapidly closing. Prost turned in, and the two McLarens interlocked, sliding into the escape road. Prost climbed out, believing the championship was his. But Senna, after receiving a push from marshals, rejoined the track, went on to win the race, and celebrated what he thought was a miraculous comeback. The joy was short-lived. The FIA, led by Prost's compatriot Jean-Marie Balestre, disqualified Senna for cutting the chicane, handing the title to Prost. Senna was fined $100,000 and given a suspended ban, cementing his belief that the sports authorities were conspiring against him. A year later, at the same circuit with the title again at stake, the roles were reversed. Senna was leading the championship, but he was incensed that the pole position, which he had earned, was placed on the dirty side of the grid, handing a theoretical advantage to Prost, now driving for Ferrari. Senna later revealed his cold-blooded calculation. If on Sunday, at the start, because I'm in the wrong place, Prost jumps the start and beats me off the line, at the first corner, I'm going for it, and he had better not turn in ahead of me, because he is not going to make it. He executed his plan with chilling precision. When the lights went out, Prost made a marginally better start and pulled slightly ahead. Senna, refusing to lift, drove his McLaren into the side of the Ferrari at over 170 meters, taking them both out of the race and securing his second world title. It was a move that shocked the world. Prost later confessed he was so sickened he considered retiring on the spot, telling reporters, "Sometimes I admit I was frightened by him. He was prepared to do anything." The rivalry had escalated beyond sport into something far more dangerous. The collisions at Suzuka were not merely racing incidents. They were the symptoms of a deeper, irreconcilable conflict of philosophy and personality. At its core, the war between Senna and Prost was a battle between two different definitions of greatness. His approach was scientific. Win at the slowest possible speed, maximize points, and avoid unnecessary risk. He saw himself as a racing purist. Senna, in contrast, embodied passion and spirituality. For him, racing was a metaphysical pursuit, a test of human will against the limits of physics. He famously stated, "If you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver," a philosophy Prost found reckless and irresponsible. This fundamental disconnect meant they weren't just competing for the same trophy. They were operating in different moral universes. The rivalry was exacerbated by a fierce political battle behind the scenes. Prost was a master of the political game, building key alliances within the FIA. However, when Senna joined McLaren, he brought with him the powerful Honda engine partnership, and the Japanese manufacturer, as devotion to the Brazilian created a political barrier even the diplomatically nimble Prost could not vault. This power struggle reached its peak after the 1989 Japanese GP, where Senna felt the FIA's decision to disqualify him was a direct result of Prost's influence, with FIA President Jean-Marie Balestre calling it a result of the politics we had. The psychological dimension was perhaps the most intense aspect of their feud. Senna used his intense public persona and spiritual convictions as weapons, projecting an image of a man on a divine mission. Prost, more reserved, was portrayed as the calculating politician. Their mind games extended to the press, with Senna famously calling Prost a coward in a 1992 press conference for having a contractual veto to prevent him from becoming a teammate at Williams. This was not just about beating a competitor, it was about breaking a man's spirit. Prost later came to understand this, stating, "I came to understand that Ayrton's main motivation, almost his sole motivation, was to focus on me and on beating me." The wheel of fate turned one final time in Adelaide, Australia. 1993. It was Prost's final race before retirement, and Senna stood alongside him on the podium after winning the Grand Prix. In a moment of profound symbolism, Senna reached out, pulled the Frenchman up to the top step, and the two former enemies stood arm in arm, spraying champagne not in rivalry, but in a shared celebration of their incredible careers. The enmity that had defined them for half a decade seemed to drain away, replaced by a mutual respect that had been buried beneath years of conflict. Prost's retirement transformed their relationship almost instantly. Freed from the intense pressure of competition, they began to see each other not as obstacles, but as the only two men who could truly understand the burden of their shared greatness. Tragically, this newfound friendship was cut devastatingly short. In the early months of 1994, Senna, now driving for Williams, began calling Prost frequently, trying to persuade him to come out of retirement and lead the Grand Prix Drivers Association to improve safety standards. They had several private discussions, with Prost noting, "Near the end, when we were close, it was very strange, because we would talk about the bad safety and this kind of thing." This period revealed a different Senna, a man concerned for his sport and his fellow drivers. Prost attended the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix at Imola as a television commentator and met with Senna twice on the morning of the race. Their final conversations were filled with foreboding, focused on the sport's safety. Hours later, Ayrton Senna was dead, killed in a crash at the Tamburello corner. The man who had been his greatest rival was now a mourner at his funeral. The legacy of Senna versus Prost is one of enduring duality. Statistically, the debate over who was the greatest remains unresolved. Ultimately, their story is the archetypal sports rivalry, a drama that has yet to be matched in its intensity and complexity. They were two sides of the same coin, the professor and the magician, the calculator and the artist, the mind and the heart. One could not have existed without the other. Their greatness was forged in the fire of their conflict. Prost himself may have captured it best when he reflected on their reconciled relationship, choosing to remember not the bitter battles, but the final, fleeting months of friendship. "I keep this souvenir from then right until his last day," Prost said. "That is why I prefer to think about that alone." The war was over, but in its place stood a legend that would forever define what it means to be a champion, and the terrible, beautiful price of greatness.